Brian Jones could play anything: sitar, dulcimer, marimba, mellotron, recorder, harmonica, organ. He'd tell anyone who'd listen. Then Jimi Hendrix picked up one instrument Brian had never seen him touch before. What happened next destroyed the most versatile musician in rock. London, November 1967. A townhouse in Chelsea, one of those Georgian buildings with high ceilings and crown molding that rock stars were buying up like candy. This one belonged to Brian Jones, founding member of the Rolling Stones, the band's multi-instrumentalist, the one who added exotic colors to their blues-based sound. The house itself reflected Brian's obsessions. Moroccan ouds hung on walls next to Japanese kotos. African thumb pianos sat on bookshelves. The place smelled of incense and old wood, the accumulated scent of instruments from around the world. Brian was 25 years old and at the peak of his creative powers, or so he told himself. He just recorded the sitar parts on Paint It Black, making it one of the first Western rock songs to use Indian instruments. He'd played marimba on Under My Thumb, dulcimer on Lady Jane, mellotron on She's a Rainbow. He was proud of this versatility, maybe too proud. The party that night was small, maybe 30 people, mostly musicians and hangers-on from London's scene. Marianne Faithfull was there. So was Keith, though he and Brian weren't speaking much anymore. The Stones were fracturing internally, tensions building, but tonight everyone was trying to be civil. Jimi Hendrix arrived around midnight with his girlfriend Kathy Etchingham. He'd been in London for just over a year, and he was already the talk of the city. Are You Experienced had come out 6 months earlier. Every guitarist in Britain was trying to figure out how he got those sounds. Brian had met Jimi a few times at clubs and other parties. They were friendly but not friends. Different musical philosophies. Brian was a purist, obsessed with authentic sounds from around the world. Jimi was an innovator, turning the electric guitar into something it had never been before. The living room was full of instruments. Brian collected them the way some people collected art. A sitar leaning against the wall, a dulcimer on the coffee table, a marimba in the corner, various recorders and flutes scattered around. His home looked like a museum of world music. Brian was holding court, as he often did at his own parties, showing off a Moroccan oud he'd just acquired. Someone asked about the sitar, and Brian launched into a detailed explanation of ragas, drone strings, the sympathetic strings underneath, the complexity of Indian classical music. Most Western musicians can't even tune a sitar properly, Brian said, his voice carrying that slight superiority that had started creeping into his tone lately. It takes years to understand. You can't just pick it up and play. Jimi was sitting on the floor nearby, quiet, listening, sipping wine. You play sitar? Someone asked Jimi. Never touched one, Jimi said. You stick to electric guitar? Brian asked, not aggressive, but pointed. Mostly. Brian smiled, that thin smile he'd get when he was about to make a point. That's the thing about electric guitar. It's limiting. One sound, one approach. I prefer versatility. I play 60 instruments. Well, 57 competently. That way I can find exactly the right sound for each song, not force every song through the same filter. The room got quieter. People sensed where this was going. How many instruments do you play, Jimi? Brian asked. Just guitar, Jimi said. Bass sometimes, piano a little. Exactly, Brian said. Nothing wrong with that, but when you limit yourself to one instrument, you limit your musical palette. You become a specialist, not a musician. Keith Richards, standing near the fireplace, shifted uncomfortably. He knew Brian was performing, trying to assert dominance, trying to prove something. Jimi didn't respond immediately. He set his wine glass down and looked at the instruments scattered around the room. His eyes settled on the dulcimer. What's that one? Jimi asked. Appalachian dulcimer, Brian said. American folk instrument. Quite beautiful tone. I used it on Lady Jane. Takes months to learn properly. The tuning is unusual. The fret spacing is different from guitar. Jimi stood up and walked over to the dulcimer. He picked it up, tested its weight, ran his fingers across the strings. Mind if I try? Jimi asked. Brian gestured generously. Be my guest. But I should warn you, it's harder than it looks. The room went silent. Everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't casual curiosity. This was Brian's challenge being met. Jimmy sat down on the couch, positioned the dulcimer on his lap, and spent about 30 seconds examining it. He plucked each string individually, listening to the pitch. He didn't ask how to tune it. He just adjusted the tuning pegs by ear until he had what he wanted. Brian watched with that same thin smile, waiting to hear the inevitable amateur fumbling. Jimmy started playing. At first, just simple notes, finding where the frets were, understanding the intervals, mapping the logic of the instrument in his mind. His fingers moved tentatively, like someone feeling for light switches in a dark room. But then something clicked. You could see it happen. The way his shoulders relaxed, the way his eyes half closed, the way his fingers stopped searching and started knowing. His fingers found a melody, not a folk song, not something traditional, something new, something that sounded both ancient and modern, like Appalachian music filtered through the electric blues of his Mississippi ancestors. He played rhythm and melody simultaneously, his thumb working the bass string while his fingers danced on the higher courses, creating harmony with just 3 strings. The dulcimer sang in a way Brian had never made it sing. Where Brian's playing was precise and studied, Jimmy's playing was something else entirely. He found the spaces between the traditional patterns, the places where the instrument wanted to go but hadn't been taken yet. Keith Richards, standing by the fireplace, slowly set his drink down. This wasn't someone learning an instrument. This was someone having a conversation with it. The room was completely still. This wasn't virtuoso showboating. This was musicianship, pure and simple. He'd taken an instrument he'd never touched before, and in 3 minutes found its soul, understood its voice, made it speak. When he stopped, there was that beat of silence that happens when something unexpected and beautiful has just occurred. That was, someone started but couldn't finish. Jimmy set the dulcimer down gently. "Beautiful instrument," he said to Brian. "Thanks for letting me try it." Brian didn't respond. He was staring at the dulcimer like it had betrayed him. "Where did you learn that?" Brian finally asked, his voice tight. "Just now," Jimmy said. "Never played one before." "That's not possible." "It's like guitar, but different intervals," Jimmy said simply. "Once you hear how the strings relate to each other, you just follow the music." Keith Richards, who'd been watching the whole thing, caught Brian's eye. Brian looked away. The party continued, but the energy had shifted. Brian disappeared into another room for a while. When he came back, he was quieter, drinking more, that performative confidence gone. Later that night, after most people had left, Keith found Brian in the music room, sitting alone with his sitar. "You all right?" Keith asked. "I've been playing sitar for 2 years," Brian said quietly. "Studying with Ravi Shankar's students, practicing every day, and I still can't make it sound right. It still sounds like a Western musician pretending to understand Eastern music." "You play it well," Keith said. "I play it competently," Brian corrected. "That's different. I collect instruments like stamps. I can play them all adequately. But Jimmy, he picked up a dulcimer for the first time and in 3 minutes understood it better than I understand any instrument I've been playing for years. He's talented." "It's not talent," Brian said. "It's something else. He doesn't learn instruments. He understands music. The instrument is just the delivery system. I've been learning delivery systems. He's been learning the language." Keith didn't know what to say to that. "I thought versatility made me special," Brian continued. "I thought knowing 60 instruments made me more of a musician than someone who only knows one. But watching him tonight, I realized I've been collecting instruments to hide behind. He doesn't need to hide. He doesn't need options. He knows music so deeply that any instrument becomes his voice." Keith wanted to argue, to tell Brian he was being too hard on himself, but he couldn't, because what Brian said was true. The next day, Brian called the session he had scheduled for the following week and canceled it. He'd been planning to add sitar to a new Stones track. He told the engineer he'd changed his mind. The weeks that followed were strange and painful to watch. Brian showed up to Stones sessions, but the spark was gone. When Mick suggested he add some exotic instrument to a track, Brian would shrug and say, "Maybe just keep it simple." The man who'd spent 2 years studying sitar suddenly wanted nothing to do with it. One afternoon, Keith found Brian in Olympic Studios during a break, staring at a Mellotron. "You going to play that or just look at it?" Keith asked. "What's the point?" Brian said quietly. "You could do it, or Nicky Hopkins could." "Brian, I've been playing sitar for 2 years, Keith. 2 years of daily practice, studying with teachers, learning ragas, and I still sound like a fake. You know what Jimmy did? He looked at a dulcimer for 30 seconds and understood its entire language. So he's talented. It's not talent. I collect sounds. I learn techniques. But Jimmy hears music itself. The instrument is just the tool. I've been so focused on the tools I forgot about the music." Keith sat down next to him. "You're overthinking this." "Am I? You and Mick write the songs. I add decorations. Little flourishes? I'm not essential. I'm ornamental. And I've spent years learning how to play lots of instruments adequately instead of learning how to play music deeply." "You play music deeply?" "No," Brian said. "I play instruments. There's a difference." Over the next few months, Brian's playing on Stone's records became less adventurous. He still added textures, still played multiple instruments, but something had changed. The confidence was gone. Where before he'd approach each instrument with pride, now there was hesitation, doubt, a sense that nothing he played mattered very much. Keith noticed. So did Mick. They didn't talk about it directly, but everyone in the band could feel Brian pulling away, retreating inward. In June 1969, less than 2 years after that party, Brian Jones was found dead in his swimming pool at his home in Hartfield, East Sussex. The official verdict was death by misadventure, drowning while under the influence of alcohol and drugs. He was 27 years old. Jimmy died 14 months later, also at 27, also from a combination of alcohol and sleeping pills. Years afterward, in a 1987 interview with Guitar Player magazine, Keith Richards was asked about Brian's final years with the Stones, about what had changed in him. "Brian lost his way," Keith said. "He'd always been fragile, but something broke in him around late 67. He became obsessed with this idea that he wasn't a real musician, that all his instruments were just tricks, just surface." The interviewer asked what caused that shift. Keith was quiet for a moment. "There was a party at Brian's place. Jimi Hendrix was there. Brian was showing off. You know how he got? Talking about all the instruments he could play. Jimmy picked up one of Brian's instruments, something Brian had been studying for months, and just played it, instantly, beautifully. I watched Brian's face and something died in his eyes right there." "Did it really affect him that much?" Keith paused, choosing his words carefully. "You have to understand Brian at that moment. He'd built his entire identity around versatility. Every time Mick and I would write a song, Brian would find some exotic instrument to make it special. That was his value to the band, his justification for being there. And in one night, watching Jimmy pick up an instrument cold and master it instantly, Brian saw that his years of collecting weren't mastery. They were compensation. For what? For not understanding music the way someone like Jimmy did. Brian's whole identity was built on being the multi-instrumentalist, the one who could play anything, the musical explorer. Then he watched someone who only played guitar understand music more deeply than he did. It shattered something in him. He was already struggling with Mick and me taking over the band, already feeling pushed out. That night with Jimmy confirmed his worst fear about himself. What fear was that? That he was a collector, not a creator. That knowing how to play 60 instruments didn't make you a better musician than someone who truly understood one. The interviewer pressed, "Do you think that contributed to his death?" Keith chose his words carefully. "Brian's death was complicated. Pills, alcohol, depression, the band situation, everything. But I think that night was part of it. He never picked up the sitar again after that. Stopped talking about his instrument collection. It was like Jimmy accidentally showed Brian that the thing he was most proud of was actually his limitation, not his strength." "Did Jimmy know how much it affected Brian?" "I don't think so," Keith said. "Jimmy was just being himself, being musical. He wasn't trying to prove anything. That's what made it worse for Brian. If Jimmy had been showing off, Brian could have dismissed it as competition. But Jimmy was just playing, just being natural. That's what broke Brian, the effortlessness of it." The story became one of those legendary moments in rock history that people debate. Some say it happened exactly as described. Others claim it's exaggerated. But those who were there that night remember. Marianne Faithfull, in her memoir, wrote, I watched Brian watch Jimmy play that dulcimer, and I saw something in Brian die. He'd built his entire identity on being the musical chameleon, the one who could do anything. And Jimmy, without meaning to, without even trying, showed him what real musical understanding looked like. The lesson wasn't that versatility is bad or that specialization is better. The lesson was simpler and more painful. Knowing how to play many instruments doesn't mean you understand music, and understanding music means any instrument can become your voice. Brian Jones played 60 instruments competently. Jimi Hendrix played one instrument completely. That night in Chelsea, the difference between competent and complete was revealed, and Brian never recovered from seeing it. If this story of pride and unintended destruction moved you, remember that true mastery isn't about how many tools you have. It's about how deeply you understand the work. Brian collected instruments. Jimmy spoke music. One survived in recordings. The other changed music forever.